Early morning sun filtered through the towering windows of the Washington, D.C. courthouse, as Sarah Bennett adjusted her navy blazer and straightened her leather briefcase. At 52, she carried herself with quiet confidence, cultivated from 2 decades of teaching constitutional law at Georgetown University Law Center. Sarah hadn't planned on being in traffic court that Monday morning. Her research on racial disparities in the justice system typically kept her in libraries and behind computer screens, crunching numbers and patterns. But something about this recent surge in complaints about discriminatory traffic citations had lured her from her comfortable office to these hard wooden benches. The courthouse was abuzz with morning activity. Security guards nodded to passers-by with familiar faces, clerks shuffled papers, while nervous defendants whispered to their lawyers. Sarah observed it all keenly, her notepad on her lap, pen moving swiftly, ink spilling onto the pages, documenting subtle interactions, how some people were greeted with smiles, while others she received curt nods on how certain defendants were allowed to speak at length, whereas others were cut off. She wasn't just any observer, though few in the room knew it as one of Georgetown's most respected professors. Sarah had shaped the minds of a great many legal professionals, including judges, who now presided in these very courts. Her articles about judicial bias were required reading in law schools from coast to coast, and her expert testimony had influenced several landmark cases about racial discrimination. Today, however, she sat discreetly in the back row, dressed conservatively in her blazer and pencil skirt, indistinguishable from any other professional who might have gotten a ticket for running a red light or some such thing. Her own citation for an alleged parking violation on K Street was tucked in her briefcase. She had thought briefly about just paying the fine online, but something about the situation, the inadequately posted signage, the officer's obnoxious attitude had made her decide to fight it. The room filled gradually with more people, young and old, well-dressed and sloppy, it seemed. From all, even more jarring were the spectrums of the diverse population of Washington. Instinctively, Sarah noticed how people fell into invisible, striking lines of demarcation. The sensitive trained eye picked out anxiety in the subways. It came across differently upon the faces: defiance, resignation, and on the few, confident ease with which the system knew well at exactly 9 a.m. The BFF's voice boomed, commanding all to their feet. Sarah rose with a rest, straight back but easy in her posture. She watched as Judge Michael Harrison entered into the courtroom, his black robes billowing behind him. His reputation preceded him as a peculiarly strict judge when it came to traffic violations, particularly if those involved were minority defendants. What this young judge could not see was that among those that he would be called upon to pass judgment on today sat nothing other than the very professor who had taught him constitutional law and had written one of his recommendations for with the appointment of Judge I.L. Sarah allowed herself a small smile as she observed his confident stride to the bench. She remembered him as an avid student, always the first to raise his hand, fervent in his quest for justice, but often blind to his own biases. With the proceedings underway, with cases called one after another, Sarah found herself continuing to observe acutely, documenting every interaction, every decision, every subtle shift in tone. She knew full well that sometimes the most powerful lessons about justice did not come from within the textbooks or lectures, but from real life experiences that were to make them confront their biases. Little did anyone in that courtroom know this quite regular Monday morning was about to turn into an extraordinary lesson in justice, humility, and the hard-headed challenge of unconscious bias in the American legal system. Judge Michael Harrison sat in his chambers, reviewing the day's docket with practiced efficiency. At 35, he was one of the youngest judges appointed to the D.C. Traffic Court, and he took immense pride in maintaining strict order in his courtroom. The morning sunlight cast as he sipped his black coffee, his clerk could arrange the day's cases in neat stacks across the polished mahogany of his desk. Parking violations, speeding tickets, and other infractions that most of his colleagues considered mundane. However, Harrison pursued each case as an opportunity to uphold the law, no matter how small the violation. A reputation for being particularly strict preceded him down the halls of the courthouse. Defense attorneys warned their clients about his no-nonsense approach, while veteran lawyers straightened a little tighter before entering his courtroom. Whispers abound that, as the youngest, he had something to prove, and others believed he was simply building a record for judicial appointments. Today's docket looked typical: 27 cases, all but a few for traffic violations. Harrison scanned them, making mental notes. His eyes paused briefly on a parking citation on K Street. He noted the name for the defense, Sarah Bennett. Something about the name tickled at his memory, but he dismissed it. Names become vaguely familiar after a few thousand cases have been handled. As he donned his black robes, Harrison recalled his law school days at Georgetown. Those halls had shaped him, molded his understanding of justice and law. He remembered passionate discussions about constitutional rights, about fairness and equality. Yet, here in traffic court, he had found his own interpretation of Justice Swift, strict and unwavering. The bailiff knocked on his door, which meant it was time. Harrison gathered his papers, squared his spine, and sucked in a deep breath. Young, his features were set into the solemn lines that he struggled to perfect. His hair was smoothed and tamed into a respectable coiffure. His robes were immaculately preened, as always the picture of judicial gravitas. Pacing down the private hallway to his courtroom, Harrison recited his personal mantras: be in control, show no favoritism, and always adhere to the letter of the law. It was those tenets that had carried him through his inaugural year on the bench with aplomb, if not certainly with goodwill. For a fleeting second his mind flashed to his constitutional law professor at Old State U, whose lessons about justice and equality had once seemed so clear now. In the daily grind of traffic court, justice seemed simpler: black and white, guilty or not guilty, pay the fine or face the consequences. The bias stood ready at the courtroom door. Harrison could hear the familiar shuffle of people rising on the other side. In a minute or two, he would take his seat in authority, prepared to dole out his justice, unsuspecting of how this typical Monday would test all that he held dear: fairness and judgment. All rise. The bay voice boomed, and Judge Harrison entered his domain, his face, stern and confident, wholly unaware that among faces turned to him was one that would remind him of lessons he had summoned, now forgotten, along his path to the bench. The morning continued with Judge Harrison's usual speed and efficiency until case number 47 was called. Sarah Bennett, parking violation on K Street, the clerk droned, her voice carrying across the crowded courtroom. Sarah rose effortlessly from her seat, deliberate movements full of dignity. As she approached the podium, several attorneys present noticed something different about her demeanor. She carried herself not with the typical nervousness of a defendant, but with the confident bearing of someone intimately familiar with courtroom proceedings. Judge Harrison barely glanced up from his papers, his voice carrying the same stern tone he used all morning. Miss Bennett, you're charged with parking in a restricted zone during rush hour. How do you play it? Sarah's voice was clear and measured as she responded, not guilty, Your Honor. She began to explain about the obstructed signage and confusing rules of parking. But Harrison cut her off mid-sentence. Something had been doing frequently with defendants that morning. Miss Bennett, he interrupted, his tone growing notably impatient. The officer's report clearly states that you were parked in a clearly marked restricted zone between 4 o'clock and 6 p.m. Are you suggesting the officer was incorrect? Several observers in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably at his tone. A few regular attorneys exchanged glances, noting how the judge's interruption seemed particularly abrupt. This time Sarah, however, remained unruffled. Your Honor, if I may, she continued with practiced calm, I have photographs showing that the sign in question was partially covered by overgrown branches, making it impossible to read the restriction times from the angle of approach. Judge Harrison's expression hardened. Had heard every excuse in the book, and this, and no more special than Miss Bennet. It is a waste of this court's time. Officer's report reflects no such obstruction. As Sarah reached into her briefcase to pull out the pictures, Harrison was waving his hand. No need for that. The responsibility for knowing when and where to park falls to the driver, not the city. The exchange continued with Sarah remaining cool and composed, while Judge Harrison became more and more confrontational, his answers brief, his voice cutting down to the regular courthouse. To those who watched, it was just one more display of the young judge exerting his authority. What was most remarkable about this exchange was how Sarah stood in extraordinary poise to this increasingly irritated judge, standing tall and keeping eye contact, answering each dismissal with the practiced patience of someone who has spent years teaching others about the very principles of justice being modeled here and now. As this exchange unfolded, the tension in the courtroom mounted. Even the bias shifting uncomfortably at his post, the other defendants waiting their turn watched with growing interest, sensing that something about this case was different from the routine traffic violations they witnessed all morning. Little did Judge Harrison know that his next decision would change what appeared to be a routine traffic case into a moment that would question his entire approach to justice. Judge Harrison leaned forward in his chair, his decision already formed before Sarah could finish her final statement. The fluorescent lights cast stern features as he gave his sentence. Miss Bennet, this court finds you guilty of infraction of City Parking Code 23.4, he said, his voice reflecting finality. Considering the fact that you completely disregarded and disrespected very visible signage, and then further took the time to question the officer's professional judgment, am setting the fine at $500, well above the ordinary $100 fine levied. A general murmur went around in the courtroom, as even the regular court officials exchanged surprised glances. This was quite a heavy fine for a minor parking ticket. Several of the lawyers present began to squirm uncomfortably at the disproportionateness of the sentence. Sarah stood stock still at the podium. Her face didn't twitch, but her eyes followed silently as Judge Harrison wrote the amount of the fine on her citation. He used a sharp, violent motion, and the young judge smiled to himself, like he thought he'd made a point about respect for the law. Further, Harrison continued, his voice even severer, I'd like to make a note for the record that this court takes a dim view of citizens who try to wriggle out of their duties by calling into question the competence of our law enforcement officers. The court reporter was typing furiously, jotting down every word. The prosecuting attorneys, those that regularly appeared in this courtroom, had never heard of such a high fine for a parking ticket. A few started scribbling notes, sensing this may precede a case in court. Sarah spoke finally. Her voice was calm and modulated, considering. Your Honor, I would accept the court's decision, she said after a moment, adjusting her glasses deliberately. However, I would like to say that this will unfortunately necessitate my having to conclude my constitutional law lecture early this afternoon. Judge Harrison barely looked up from the papers on his desk, still writing down his final remarks about the case. Miss Bennet, your scheduling conflicts are not this court's problem. You should have thought about your professional responsibilities before breaking city parking laws. The courtroom remained exceptionally still, the tension thick enough to cut. Even the bailiffs, who had seen 1,000 cases come through these doors, seemed to sense something big was about to. The morning sun unfolded outside, reaching its peak and casting long rectangles of light across the courtroom floor, illuminating dust particles dancing in the air. Sarah gathered her things unhurriedly, every action deliberate and serene. There was no anger, no frustration in her bearing at the harshness of the sentence. There was just something there in her person, a quiet confidence. This tale was far from over. The next case was already being called, but a number of eyes remained on Sarah. As she made her way back to her seat, Judge Harrison had already moved on, unaware that his next realization would shake the very foundations of his judicial confidence. Sarah's measured voice carried through the courtroom, as she added one final comment, "I do need to finish grading papers for tomorrow's advanced seminar at Georgetown Law. You remember those deadlines well, don't you, Judge Harrison, from when you were in my constitutional law class? 10 years ago." The courtroom fell into complete silence. Judge Harrison's hand froze mid summation, and his face noticeably paled. It hit him like an external force as memories flooded back. Professor Bennett standing at the front of the lecture hall, charging students to deeply consider issues of justice, fairness, and unconscious bias. Several of the attorneys in the gallery audibly gasped. The court clerk's fingers hovered, unmoving, over her keyboard. Even the normally stoic bailiff wrestled with displaying any professional composure. Judge Harrison slowly looked up, for the first time that morning, really seeing Sarah Bennett. She was standing there, precisely as he had known her during his days in the law school, the same air of authority, the same inquiring glint in her eye that surmised his readiness to understand complex constitutional precepts. The irony smote. Here was Professor Bennett, who had written one of his strongest letters of recommendation for judicial appointment and extolled his sense of equal justice under the law, just shown how far he had strayed from those very principles. Memories tumbled back of passionate lectures about judicial temperament, of her warnings about the subtle ways in which bias could creep into decision-making, and her emphasis upon weighing the merits of each case in equal measure, without regard to defendant background. The young judge's face flushed bright red in embarrassment as he realized that a moment before had just provided a perfect case study in exactly the kind of biased judgment she had taught him to guard against. Sarah remained standing. Her expression wasn't triumphant, nor accusing. She was still the teacher, and this had become an unexpected lesson not just for her former student, but to everyone in the courtroom. The silence just drug and drug. Those who regularly watched the court would later claim that was the longest pause they had ever witnessed in traffic court. The morning sun continued to creep across the courtroom floor, a spotlight on stage where an extraordinary drama was playing out. Judge Harrison looked down at the excessive fine he had just imposed, then back at his former professor. In that moment, he was no longer the confident the young judge. Once again, the law student, who had sat so keen in her classroom learning about the very principles had just failed to uphold. Judge Harrison's courtroom remained frozen in stunned silence as he stared at Professor Bennett, his former mentor, who had shaped his early understanding of justice. 10 minutes recess, he announced suddenly, his voice cracking. The gavel bang resounded across the silent room. Without any eye contact with anybody, he swiftly withdrew to his chambers, his black robes billowing behind him, and Harrison plopped into his leather chair inside, unloosening his collar. His hands were still shaking as he reached for a Georgetown Law old yearbook inside his bottom drawer. There she was, Professor Sarah Bennett, photographed during his graduating year, proudly standing with the constitutional law faculty. Memories flooded back. Her passionate lectures about equal justice, her patient guidance during office hours, and most painfully, her glowing letter of recommendation that had helped launch his judicial career. The very letter sat framed on his wall, its words now seeming to taunt him. Harrison felt he replayed in his mind the morning's proceedings in his chambers, had cut her off sooner than he did other defendants, had ignored her evidence, had levied a fine 5 times the normal, and had done it all without once actually looking into her face. The bell knocked softly to indicate that the recess was about to end. Standing before his mirror, seeing himself through new eyes, the young judge, proud of being strict yet fair, now seemed to act like precisely what he was, a man that had lost vision of the fundamental principles his professor worked so hard to instill in him. Outside his chambers, the courtroom abuzz with whispered conversations, attorneys that regularly appeared before him exchanged knowing looks. They wondered how this revelation would affect the young judge they came to know. Sarah sat before her desk, grading papers, as if today was any other day in her decades-long career of teaching justice. To the future lawyers present, her poise made the moment even more poignant, because not only had she not come for a fight, but she had allowed the moment to be a teachable one. Harrison took a few deep breaths, squared his robes, and steeled himself upon re-entering the courtroom. He knew the next few minutes would define not just this case, but possibly his whole judicial career. Judge Harrison stepped back into his courtroom. His body language was dramatically different. The skip in his step had been replaced by a measured stride, and his expression now was thoughtful rather than stern. Professor Bennett began. An unusual dose of humility laced his tone for the frequent attendees of the court. I owe you, and this court, an apology. My behavior this morning fell far short of the varied principles of justice you taught me 10 years ago. He took a deep breath before continuing. I've let my position blind me to my own predispositions today. You've given all of us a valuable lesson on the importance of fair and equal treatment under the law. The courtroom was silent until Harrison reached for Professor Bennett's citation. I am waiving the $500 fine. Moreover, I am dismissing this case in its entirety based on the unclear signage to which you drew the court's attention. Sarah nodded graciously, but Judge Harrison wasn't finished. Professor Bennett, your lessons about constitutional rights and equal justice weren't just classroom theory, they were principles I swore to uphold today. I failed to live up to those principles. He turned to address the entire courtroom. Let this be a reminder to everyone present, myself especially, that justice must be blind to prejudice, then not to reason. Our duty is to hear each case with fresh ears, and see each person before us with clear eyes. The regular attorneys exchanged impressed glances. This was unprecedented, a judge publicly acknowledging his bias and correcting his mistakes. Several began making notes, recognizing they were witnessing a remarkable moment in the court's history. Sarah finally spoke, her voice carrying the same educational tone she had used in countless lectures. Thank you, Judge Harrison. This moment illustrates why in our legal system, which is based not just on rules, but on humility and wisdom of those who interpret them, the transformation in the courtroom was palpable. What had begun as a routine traffic court session had gradually become a deeper lesson in justice, humility, and the ongoing struggle against unconscious bias. The other defendants and attorneys present watched him continue the day's proceedings with a dramatically different approach, more patient, more attentive, more balanced in his considerations. 3 months after the incident at Courtroom Georgetown Law, the school's central auditorium was standing room only as Judge Michael Harrison stood at the podium alongside Professor Sarah Bennett, addressing an engrossed gathering of law students and faculty. What happened that day in traffic court, Harrison said, wasn't about a parking ticket, but about how our biases can blind our judgment even when we think we're being fair. The case had become a remarkably instructive tool at Georgetown Law. Professor Bennett had integrated it into her syllabus, leveraging it for be a prime example of unconscious bias operating, even in seemingly minor legal matters. The story had spread beyond Georgetown legal journals and judicial education programs nationwide. Judge Harrison's courtroom was different, observed ordinary lawyers presenting cases before him. The marked change in his demeanor signaled that every case was a possibility to be weighed seriously, regardless of how the defendant presented himself or his background. His notoriety flipped from being the most brutal judge to being the most open-minded on the bench. The incident had long since been transformed into a seminal research paper by Professor Bennett, entitled Justice in the Mirror, Examining Judicial Bias in Minor Courts. It already was informing judicial training programs around the country. Sometimes Professor Bennett stood before an audience of judges and declared that the most powerful lessons about justice come in moments we least anticipate. What counts isn't that we err, but how we respond when our blind spots are revealed. The incident sparked a broader conversation within the D.C. court system. Other judges started reviewing their own decision-making patterns, yielded new guidelines for the handling of traffic court cases. Statistical analyses indicated a much reduced trend in disparate sentencing across the demographic groups. As the lecture closed, a student did ask Judge Harrison what was the single most important thing he had learned from the experience. He smiled thoughtfully before replying, "Justice isn't just about knowing the law. It's about remaining humble enough to recognize our own prejudices and brave enough to correct them." The case had become known as the professor's lesson. It was a reminder among law students that true justice requires constant self-examination and the courage to admit when we have fallen short of our ideals. The courtroom was frozen in stunned silence. Judge Harrison stared at Professor Bennett, his former mentor, who had shaped his early understanding of justice. His hands knuckle-white as he gripped the wooden bench. 10 minutes recess, he announced abruptly. The gav's sharp crack resounded through the silent chamber. Without meeting anybody's eyes, he beat a quick retreat to his chambers, black robes flowing behind him, billowing behind him like a storm cloud. Once inside, Harrison sank into his leather chair. His hands shook as he pulled an old Georgetown Law yearbook from his bottom drawer. There she was, Professor Sarah Bennett, photographed during his graduating year. Her eyes, soft yet demanding, looked back at him across the chasm of years. Memories flooded his mind as if a dam had burst. Her impassioned lectures about equal justice under the law, her patient guidance during office hours as he struggled with complex constitutional concepts, and most painfully her glowing letter of recommendation that helped launch his judicial career, a letter set and framed on his wall, whose words now seemed to mock his recent actions. In the silence of his chambers, Harrison replayed the morning proceedings with growing horror. He had cut her off sooner than other defendants. He hadn't considered any evidence she had to present. The fine he imposed had been 5 times the norm, and he had accomplished it all without once really looking at her face. The shame burning in his chest as he remembered her lessons on judicial temperament and unconscious bias. How often had she warned their class about the ways prejudice could creep in subconsciously to decision-making? Now he had turned into a perfect case study in everything she had taught them to guard against. Present in the courtroom, whispers dart across the gallery as attorneys who regularly come before Harrison exchange knowing glances. The court officers, trying to maintain professional demeanor, cannot help but steal new respect glances at Professor Bennett. Sarah was calm, as if this were another teachable moment in her decades-long career grading papers. Her calm manner made it all the more poignant. She didn't come for confrontation, but let the moment be a powerful lesson in justice and humility. The bay rapped SL on Harrison's chamber door, signifying the recess was all but over. Before his mirror stood the young judge, a vision of himself seen through different eyes now. This hard disciplinarian, who had boasted to himself that he was harsh but fair, now appeared as precisely what he had turned into, a man who had lost vision of the basic principles his professor had worked so hard to instill. It was then, as he went back inside the courtroom, that Harrison knew the next few minutes would define not just this case, but possibly his whole judicial career. It weighed heavy upon his shoulders as he straightened his robes, garnering his courage to face the truth about himself and his actions. He thought about what Professor Bennett would expect from him now. Not excuses, not defensiveness, but honest self-reflection and the ability to change course. The lessons she had taught so many years ago were about to take on their greatest test, but not in classroom discussion. It was time for real-world application. The next rap at his chamber door was insistent the recess was over, and a decision needed to be made. With one final deep breath, Judge Harrison squared his shoulders. It was now time to prove that, yes, all those years ago, he had learned from Professor Bennett how to live up to the standard the latter had set.